Hey everybody, Ruckdog here. Before I get into the main video, I just wanted to say I am sorry this took so long to get out. I've been pretty busy with some real life things, plus this video is going to be a little longer and a little more complex than a few of the ones that I've done in the recent past. However, the topic for today, getting started in naval gaming, is something that's been requested by you guys in the comments section. So I figured that it would be a good one to tackle, but between real life and just the complexity of the subject matter, it's taken me a bit longer than I would have liked to get this video out. So my apologies for that. I have been doing a few things behind the scenes to improve the recording and the editing for these videos, and I hope that you will find the final result to be worth your wait. And with that, let's get on with the video. Ahoy there! This time around, I'm going to be talking about naval wargaming from the perspective of someone who is just starting out. Perhaps you are new to the wargaming hobby in total, or perhaps you are familiar with wargaming and are looking to try something new. Either way, hopefully you will find something useful in this video. As always, let's take a quick look at the topics we're covering in this video. First, I'll briefly discuss why you might want to try a naval game in the first place. Next, I'll spend some time building a framework that will hopefully allow newcomers to make sense of the incredible variety and diversity of naval games out there. I'll attempt to provide a basic overview of the different subgenres and settings that are out there, and then having established these rough categories, I'll then touch on the topic of scale, both of physical miniatures and of the game itself. Once we've got a handle on the naval gaming landscape, so to speak, I'll then dive into the meat of the topic, which is what one should consider when picking a rule set and the accompanying miniatures. I'll do my best to cover games across the spectrum to include low cost and even free options to those that are a little bit more expensive to buy into. So, why naval gaming? Now, the reasons why you might want to look at naval gaming and what makes naval gaming so distinct is worthy of its own video, and I do plan to do that at some point. For now, though, let's summarize it this way. First of all, the barrier to entry for naval gaming is going to be somewhat lower than it will be for a lot of land-based games. Due to needing fewer models and less terrain, your average naval game is going to be less expensive in terms of time and money. Additionally, the mechanics and gameplay for a naval game tend to be very different to land-based games, which provides for great variety, especially if you're an already established miniature gamer. And then thirdly, naval games provide a great thematic way to explore different aspects of your favorite time frame or setting. Now, probably the first question I would ask any potential naval gamer is, what game do you want to play? And for a complete newcomer to miniature wargaming, that inevitably leads to a follow-on question of, what do you find interesting? And when answering such questions, I personally find it helpful to have some idea of what the boundaries are to my set of options. So we're going to start with a bit of an overview of naval wargaming in order to give a little bit of context for these questions. So I will begin with a breakdown of what flavors of naval game are typically seen on the market. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a general overview and by no means inclusive. I will readily admit up front that there are undoubtedly games that I have failed to touch on, and maybe entire subcategories of game that I have failed to touch on. However, what I am presenting here will hopefully cover 90% plus of the various games that you can go and find either online or in your local store. So the first major split in different types of naval games that I see are between what I call historical games, those games that are based on real historical conflicts and are using historical ships, and the sci-fi fantasy games, which are those that are based in settings that are either partly or entirely made up. On the historical side, the major time periods for naval gaming include ancients, think galleys and triremes, Age of Sail, World War I, World War II, and modern. The exact divisions between the different epochs I'm showing here can be somewhat imprecise. While it is relatively easy when it comes to discussing a major conflict like World War II that has a definite or at least widely agreed upon beginning and end, others are a bit messier. The Age of Sail, for example, could arguably include anything from the Middle Ages up to the mid-19th century. Likewise, modern would mean everything from the early Cold War up to the present day. However, I tend to bin the games in these 5 categories because 1, they capture the large majority of games that I've encountered, and 2, they tend to nicely encapsulate the types of mechanics and gameplay that you'll tend to see. Age of Sail games are very concerned with wind direction, for example, while modern games have to deal with these nasty little things called anti-ship missiles, and so on. For what it's worth, from my experience, World War II is by far the most popular era, followed by the Age of Sail. World War I and modern seem to be about tied in popularity, while the ancients are very much a rarity, very few and far between. On the sci-fi fantasy side of the divide, the major categories as I see it are space, alternate history, and fantasy. Now, space is fairly obvious as a category, and also extremely diverse, as it encompasses everything from X-Wing to Starfleet battles. As a likely consequence of that diversity, space naval games are quite popular. In fact, I'm willing to wager that space combat games are rivaled only by World War II naval games in overall popularity. I don't have a lot of hard data to back that up, but that has been largely my observation from walking around stores and shows over the years. The alternate history category is a bit of a catch-all, and typically this means a pulp setting, also referred to as steampunk or Victorian science fiction. One of my personal favorite games, Dystopian Wars, is squarely in this category. An interesting subcategory of the alternate history category are airship combat games, such as Leviathans or Castles in the Sky. Now, I grant you, neither of these are, strictly speaking, Victorian. They are actually technically Edwardian, as it turns out, but they are still definitely a part of that alt history pulp / kind of steampunk genre. And finally, there's the fantasy category. Now, specifically, I'm talking about Tolkien-esque high fantasy here. Humans, elves, orcs, and the like. I would say that the current leading example of this subcategory is Mantic's Kings of War Armada. And so there you go. This is how I see the basic categories of naval games. I'm sure there are many of you out there saying, what about this game? Or even giving me the famous, well, actually, reaction to that chart. But to that, I simply direct you back to my statement earlier that this is a very simplified overview and isn't going to perfectly encapsulate every game on the market. However, hopefully newcomers will still find it of some use. I definitely want to come back and expound on these various subgenres in the future, as I think there's a lot to talk about, even with my simplified model shown here. For example, the question of what exactly qualifies as fantasy is one I could do a whole video on. And now that I mention it, I just might. For now, though, let's move on. Now, scale is an interesting word with regards to miniature gaming. Most gamers will immediately associate that word with the physical size of the miniatures, so I'll start there. Going off the categories stated earlier, I'll start with the standard scales for the historical gaming side of the chart. Now, traditionally, historical games have been played at 1/300, 1/600, 1/1200, 2400, 3000, and even 1/6000 scales. In general, the larger scales, and by larger I mean the scale results in a larger model, so really the number on the other side of the slash has to be smaller, not larger. It's a little confusing, I know. But anyway, the larger scales have been used a lot for Age of Sail and ancient games, since the ships were physically smaller during those eras, and the engagement ranges that these battles were being fought at were shorter. So using a large scale rendered models of a reasonable size, so a 1/600 ship of the line is going to be roughly 2 to 3 inches in length, which is a pretty decent size for a gaming miniature, and it also makes the table scale a bit more believable. By the time we get to World War II and modern, the larger ships and the longer engagement ranges make the smaller scales much more popular. A special note is 1/1800 scale, which is a relative newcomer to the naval gaming hobby. This scale was essentially created by the Axis and Allies Naval Miniatures game, aka War at Sea. That game launched in 2008, and with its pre-painted miniatures, it was very popular. And that popularity resulted in the 1/1800 scale for Wargaming. And since that time, the popularity of the scale has only grown. And you see a lot of various 3D prints and STL files for that scale available online. And the recent relaunch of Victory at Sea from Warlord Games is also using this scale. Now, on the sci-fi fantasy side, space games are less about the specific scale and more about the overall size of the miniatures. In general, I'd like to go by the 3 rough size bins that I first encountered on the Star Ranger website. The smallest bin is fleet scale, where large ships, such as battleships, are roughly 2 to 3 inches in length. Next is squadron scale, where large ships range up to about 4 or 5 inches. And then the largest grouping is large scale, where ships can grow to be 6 inches or more in length. Now, the large size was first popularized by Battlefleet Gothic in the late 1990s, and has since come to dominate the market in many ways. Star Wars Armada and Firestorm Armada, arguably the 2 most successful space combat games in the last decade, both fit into the large category. In general, though, scale and miniature sizes are less important for space games, as most rule sets measure ranges not from the minis, but from the stems of the flying bases that the minis are based on. Now, when we talk about fantasy and alternate history games, they tend to largely follow the historical naval gaming scales, since they are at least loosely based on real-world naval technology. Mentioning a couple of examples again, Dystopian Wars is nominally about a 1/1200 scale, which is right in line with certain historical miniatures. And then the Kings of War Armada ships are roughly in that 1/300, 1/600 range for Age of Sail miniatures. Now, at this point, having hopefully provided sufficient context, I now turn back to getting started in naval gaming, the question that we posed at the beginning of this video. As a reminder, here are the 2 questions I would ask any potential new naval gamer. What game do you want to play, and what do you find interesting? At the start, I would look to decide what subcategory of game that their interests fall into, and what scale of game they're interested in. That will help narrow down the search quite a bit. As an example, let's say that I've chosen space naval gaming as my choice, and I'm particularly interested in a specific IP, such as Halo. For example, the picture here is a shot of a few of the Covenant ships that I painted for Halo fleet battles. Now, that will narrow my search considerably, although not as much as one might imagine, because there are indeed well-made, officially licensed games for just about every major space IP out there, from Star Trek and Star Wars down to Babylon 5. However, there is also a lot of fan-made rules and fan-made conversions for other rule sets. To give just one small example, there is now an entire fan-made conversion of the Star Wars Armada game that allows you to play Star Trek ships on the table using the Star Wars Armada game engine. So clearly, just a choice of IP by itself is not sufficient to get you to a solid answer for what game you should play. So there's some other considerations. For example, who are you going to be playing the game with? Now, if you have a local community that is already active in a specific naval game, or in naval games generally, then that is very helpful because it gives you a ready-made support network, and your choice of game might already be made for you. If, for example, you live in an area where there's a very strong Star Wars Armada community, then maybe even if Star Wars isn't your first choice of IP, you go into Star Wars Armada just because there's a community to play with. On the other hand, you might be looking to start a community from scratch, which is a position I've found myself in a number of times over the years, especially when I move to a new area and there's nobody in that area that's particularly interested in playing any of the naval games that I like. When you're doing that, it makes your choices a little more constrained, and you might be best served to select a game that's readily available at retail. in part to help support whatever stores you may or may not be playing at, but also because when you're attempting to entice new gamers into a game, especially if you don't know them already, then it's helpful for them to join in by buying a product off the shelf, essentially, instead of having to go through secondhand stores or eBay or 3D printing or what have you. And of course, there's also a possibility we might consider where this really isn't about community at all, but rather you and one or two close friends or family members may simply be looking for a game to play with each other. And in that situation, there is less of a need to have a game that can be easily bought into by a newcomer, since the game becomes a cooperative project between a small number of individuals. And last but not least, if this is something you are going to be doing partially or totally by yourself, then it becomes much more important to find a game with good solitaire rules. Now, fortunately, well, perhaps unfortunately given the circumstances, but as a result, let's say it that way, as a result of the pandemic, the number of games that were either built from the ground up with solitaire modes or have had them added onto has grown greatly. So going it alone in the naval gaming hobby is easier now than it has ever been. A major decision to make is what rules you will use, and this choice will help drive cost. Rules might be completely free, or else a free sample of the rules might be available. Star Wars Armada, Dropfleet Commander, and Dystopian Wars are all games that are currently in production and have their rules for free via downloads from their various websites. Older games that are now solely fan-supported, such as Battlefleet Gothic, are also available for free. For those games that do not have free rules, your next option would be to do some research first to see if you will like the rules enough to invest in a copy. You could track down Let's Play videos, podcast reviews, such as the ones I do over on the MBS podcast, or a blog post that discuss the basics of how the game works. You might also be able to get a demo of the game from a friend or maybe even directly from the company that publishes the game at a convention if they happen to be there presenting. The important thing to understand is that the rules you select will determine how many models you will need, what type of models you will need, along with however many other components you might need, such as dice, markers, templates, and other such items. That in turn will have a major impact on how expensive your chosen game will be to get into. Once you have the rules sorted, the next matter of business is models. Now, for most naval miniature games, the models used to represent your ships on the tabletop are going to be the most significant expense in terms of time and money. There are some ways around paying that cost up front, especially if you aren't sure if you would like to try or buy into the game just yet. First, many naval games are playable on a computer using programs such as Tabletop Simulator or Vassal. In addition to trying a game out, these methods are also great for playing the game with friends when you're unable to meet in person for whatever reason. If you decide to move into the physical realm, or if you'd simply prefer to play your game physically, then you still have some low-cost options. For example, there are a number of print-and-play options for naval miniatures of all sorts, from starships to triremes. And for a slightly more upscale option, you can use board game markers or the offerings from Topside Minis to up the look of your game for a relatively nominal cost. These will all be 2D representations of ships, though, so there's a limit on just how immersive your tabletop can become. Moving to 3 dimensions adds significant expense, though even here there is a range of options to suit different budgets and price points. If you are finding it difficult to justify the expense of purchasing highly detailed metal ship models from GHQ, for example, XP Forge has much more economical 3D printed versions of many of the same ships available. As a side note, in my opinion, if you have settled on a specific naval game that is being produced and supported with a bespoke line of miniatures by a game company, it is generally preferable to support that company and the game by buying into that range of miniatures if you are able to do so. That will help to support the game and keep that support going. And it might also aid greatly with the next topic I want to cover, which is supporting components. What I mean when I say supporting components are things like special dice and movement templates, firing gauges, status tokens, cards, dials, and so on. Naval games, like all miniatures games, use these devices to greater or lesser degrees. Some games are relatively heavily dependent on such components, like Star Wars Armada. In such cases, the most cost-effective way to get a set of these components is to buy the starter sets from the company that produces the game. Replacements and or substitutes for these components might well be available, but these are typically marketed as premium upgrades for the stock items and therefore cost a bit more. Going back to Star Wars Armada, there's a fellow out there that goes by Admiral Tater, and he does amazing work with custom movement and measuring tools that are themed to particular factions and commanders. However, that quality does not come cheap, and his products are generally aimed at the hardcore fans and are hardly necessary for a player that's just starting out. For games that require fewer components or else are out of production and as such official components are hard to come by, there are a number of low-cost options available. Most such games have print-and-play sheets of tokens and markers available, for example. These can either be printed out and cut out to be used as is, or else you can mount these printed bits of paper to cardboard or even wooden bases. I find that 20 by 20 millimeter square wooden bases are perfect for this use, and you can get about 100 of them for $12 US off of Litgo Aerosystems website. Special dice can be trickier, although it is in principle an easy matter to use standard dice and a conversion chart. That is a bit clunky to be sure, but can be an effective way to minimize costs when first starting out. I've also found that it isn't too hard to get used to after a game or two, thinking back to my experiences with the Dystopian Wars 3.0 beta. Now, it's also possible that a third party has stepped up to provide alternatives to those custom dice. So, for example, the Baron of Dice, an independent dice company, has several sets of the special D6s that are used in Battlefleet Gothic to mark special orders. Now, these dice aren't exactly cheap, but they can be less than you might pay for a set of the original Games Workshop special order dice off of outfits such as eBay. And with that, it's probably about time we start wrapping things up here. Thanks to everybody for sticking with me this far. I could have done a deep dive on several of the points I've just made, but this video is kind of getting a little long already, and so for now, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. To recap, we talked about why you might want to give naval gaming a try and some of the questions to ask when you are getting started, which we informed with an overview of what the naval gaming hobby looks like from the perspective of what the different options are out there. I then finished up with taking a look at some of the other things you might consider when selecting a naval game to try. Now, hopefully, if you are looking to get into naval gaming, this video has given you a few ideas about how to proceed. And if you are already a naval gamer, I hope this video gives you a few new ideas, but if not, then at least I hope it will be a resource you can point potential converts to. And of course, a lot of things I talked about here could also be applied to miniature gaming as a whole, but I've purposely kept the focus a bit narrow because, after all, this is a Naval Wargaming channel and I'm a Naval Wargaming fan. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for all of you who have left comments and expressed support for what I'm doing here. It really does mean a lot to me, and please keep the feedback coming. And if there's a topic you want me to discuss in the future, well, let me know in the comments. Until next time, this is Ruckdog saying good luck and good hunting.